I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the Haval H6. So what exactly is the Haval H6? If you haven't heard of this car, you won't be alone, and that's because it's part of a crop of new Chinese crossovers that are becoming really quite popular here in Australia. The MGs are, a similar thing, different company to Haval, which is actually owned by Great Wall Motors, or GWM. And if you're a subscriber, and I encourage you to subscribe, you will have seen that we've got a couple of reviews up recently on the Haval Jolion, which sits underneath the H6 in this brand's lineup, and also on the GWM Ute, which is kind of like a Hilux or Ranger competitor. The H6, however, enters Australia's most popular segment, and that is mid-size SUVs. So this car is going up against seriously big names like the Mazda CX-5, the Hyundai Tucson, and the Volkswagen Tiguan. And in today's video, we're going to see whether or not the H6 really stacks up to those cars. Now, we don't do any kind of sponsored content here at Chasing Cars, so you're going to get my objective opinion on this car and how it really does stack up. It'll be treated fairly in today's video, particularly given the fact that this car comes in at a price which is really quite compelling. So I've got the mid-spec H6 Lux here, and it's $33,990 drive away. So that's considerably cheaper than a base model from almost any of this car's rivals. And as you'll see in today's video, the features that you get on it certainly don't scream base model. Instead, it's actually quite well equipped. It looks quite good. It's got all this chrome garnishing. It's got LED headlights and tail lights and a whole bunch of safety tech across the range. So what's the catch? Is there a catch? We're gonna be finding out. We'll start inside, but if you haven't already subscribed, do so below the video. As I mentioned, the Haval H6 sits above the Haval Jolion in this brand's lineup. Now, the Jolion is a small SUV, but as we discovered in that review, which I did a couple of weeks ago, it has a massive back seat. Now, given that the H6 is still only a 5-seater, it does have a bigger boot. It is a bigger car, which some people will like, but you may want to consider that Jolion because that's actually more of a screaming deal than the H6 is. The prices on the H6 effectively start where the Jolion stops. So a base H6 is $30,990 drive away, but personally, I don't think you really want that one because it has cloth seats, it has a plastic steering wheel, the interior just feels a little bit lower rent than what you get in this mid-spec Lux and especially the top-spec Ultra. Now, of course, going up the range does incur more costs, but I think for $33,990 drive away, the Lux probably makes the most sense. It doesn't get things like cooled seats, that's exclusive to the Ultra, as is a panoramic sunroof, but you do get a pretty good level of spec. So we've got these part leather seats, electric adjustment for the driver, only 6-way electric adjustment though, still no under thigh angle adjust, so the seat base feels really flat, but we do get power lumbar, so you've got good back support for longer drives. The Lux also upgrades to this leather steering wheel with quite pleasant contrast stitching, and the material quality throughout the interior is pretty good actually. Lots of soft materials, more than you get on some of this car's rivals, up here on the doors as well. And the design of the interior, I think it's hard to complain about. It looks very fresh, futuristic, but just like I said on my review of the Jolion and also the GWM Ute, it's some of the software and the tuning which lets you know that Haval has some way to go in terms of implementing these systems as naturally and intuitively as what you find on a Hyundai Tucson or a Mazda CX-5. So we've got this 10-inch touchscreen, it's 12 inches on the Ultra, and it's just a bit sort of nondescript. It is really crisp, high resolution, and the processing power is good. And the system on it isn't as random as on the Jolion. So for example, all right, I want my heated seats, no button to do that, okay. But we just swipe once to the right and then we've got heated seat controls. We've got drive modes. Again, it's like, why is some of this stuff in the touchscreen? But it's not as far away as it is on some of this brand's other cars. Then in front of me, we've got a very cool 10-inch digital gauge cluster, which with no cowl, it looks very good. And actually the glare factor isn't too bad. It's certainly not as bad as my long-term RAV4 hybrid. And you can even set it to space mode with a rotating planet in front of you in case you forget where you live in the solar system. I suppose that's quite nice. And in terms of the rest of the structure, we got this sort of flying buttress thing, which is actually screwed together pretty well. better than some mainstream cars. Big cup holders, big door bins that'll fit a decent water bottle in them. The driving position is okay. So hopefully what you're getting is, for such a cheap midsize SUV, there's actually not a huge amount to complain about in here. It's really quite livable. All right, let's check out those back seats. Here in the back of the Haval H6, again, we see that the Chinese manufacturers clearly put a high priority on rear seat space. And to be honest, that's a good thing here in Australia. A lot of people have pretty tall kids and they're gonna fit into the H6, whereas in something like a CX-5, the second row of that car is honestly a bit of a squeeze. So for myself at 6 foot, you can see I've got heaps of room. Headroom, no issue at all. The mid-spec Lux doesn't have a sunroof, but there's so much space up there that even if you had the Ultra, it'd be fine. Leg room behind my own driving position, plentiful, lots of toe room. And again, we've got almost a completely flat floor in the H6, so using this middle seat is actually going to be possible. Now, this car is actually pretty long, so it's a bit of a shame that you can't get an H6 with just a dinky little third row in the back, which would make it even more practical, but there you go. Now, rear air vents, they're standard across the range for Australia, which is really smart. We've also got 2 more USB ports back here for devices. We've got a map pocket in the back of each seat. We've got a flip down armrest with 2 cup holders. But materials do go back to pretty hard here. And again, the seat base, it's just too flat to support your legs properly on a long drive. But pretty slim pickings for criticism. It's a big and usable rear seat. Here around the back of the Haval H6, personally, I think this SUV is quite presentable. We've got this full width light bar that does actually light up at night, and that gives this crossover a pretty cool light signature when you're following behind it. But yet again, it shows another model that pays dividends from GWM investing in quite attractive exterior and interior design. This thing doesn't look like an El Cheapo shitbox, if you ask me. What it does have though is too many badges. Someone was allowed to go crazy with badges on the back of this, and I don't think it was the chief designer. So we've got Haval, whatever, GWM down there, but then we've got H6 2.0 GDIT, gasoline direct injected turbo. No one cares. I'd skip that badge. Now, we've got a manual tailgate on the entry-level premium and the mid-spec Lux, but the top-spec Ultra, which does cost a little more than this car, 3 grand more in two-wheel drive, 5 grand more if you want an all drive, that gets a power tailgate. Either way, they all get 600 litres of boot space, and as you can see, that floor is totally flush with the sill of the boot, so it makes it nice and easy to get stuff in and out. Then underneath that boot floor, we do in fact have a space saver spare, which gives you a little bit more confidence for touring in this car. In terms of other features, it's okay. We've got this cargo blind here. It's certainly not the flimsiest one I've ever felt, but the boot door itself is a little heavier than some, so potentially that top spec car might appeal if you're often packing heavy stuff into the boot. Last thing before we go for a drive, running costs. So the running costs of the Haval H6, they're actually attractively quite low, and that starts with servicing, which is capped for the first 5 years. But I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but with these Great Wall derived vehicles, the service intervals are unnecessarily complicated. So thankfully on this car, they're not that bad. You have to get it serviced annually, but the first one is at 10,000 Ks, and then each one after that is at 15,000 Ks. But either way, those first 5 services add up to $1,560, which is a little bit better than average for this class. Fuel consumption, the 2-litre turbo petrol in this car isn't really a huge standout in the class for efficiency, but you can expect 9 to 10 litres per 100 Ks in mixed driving with this car. And the warranty on the H6, impressively, is 7 years with unlimited kilometres, matching vehicles like the Kia Sportage, but a little bit short of that 10-year offer you get on the Mitsubishi Outlander. So what's the Haval H6 like to drive? Well, I've brought it out here to a nice little country road, which also has a few slower urban sections to kind of get a good idea of how this midsize SUV compares. And interestingly, where I am now is exactly where we did our top 5 midsize SUVs video last year. So you remember I assembled my picks around that 45-50 grand mark in the midsize SUV space. So we had cars like the Kodiaq RAV4 Hybrid, the Sportage Diesel, the Volvo XC40 and the Mazda CX-5 Turbo. So well-trodden path for working out what these midsize SUVs are really like. And the first thing is that the H6 slots into this class really quite well. I think midsize SUVs, they've been Australia's most popular segment for several years running now, but the space has been crying out for a great value kind of price leader. Now, the H6 is potentially that car. It's very affordable. It doesn't have to rewrite the rule book for midsize SUVs. It doesn't have to come in and be my number one midsize SUV pick, because at the end of the day, it's a solid $3,000 or $4,000 less than a base Tucson on the road. And you'll know from my recent review of the base Tucson, if you're a subscriber, that car is really good to drive from a ride and handling point of view, but its engine and gearbox is absolutely woeful for the money. Whereas here in the Haval H6, we've kind of got the opposite proposition. The ride and handling isn't bad, I'll come back to it, but it's significantly less developed than where the Tucson is, where the CX-5 is, and where the Tiguan and Kodiaq are, to name a few examples. But let's start with the engine, because that's actually a really strong point for the Haval H6. Whereas almost every base model in the midsize SUV segment gives you an asthmatic, screaming, naturally aspirated petrol engine, in the H6 you actually get quite a nice unit. You get a 2-litre turbocharged, direct injected petrol 4-cylinder producing 150 kilowatts of power and 320 newton meters of torque. And that just blows away a 2-litre Tucson, a 2-litre CX-5, and it's healthily more generous than something like a Tiguan 110 TSI as well. And from an engine standpoint, the H6 feels really quite well endowed. There's always torque when you want it, and the gearbox, which is a wet dual clutch automatic 7-speed unit shared with a bunch of other GWM products, it keeps this engine in that nice meaty low RPM point where it just makes really effortless progress. And it's only when you open it up, like now, where you start to hear the engine, but even then it never yells at you, it's never that loud. It's always pretty refined. The only exception is under moderate load, like going up a long hill, just holding revs, it has this metallic tinkling, ticking kind of sound to it. It's not the best sounding engine when you're allowed to hear it, but most of the time when you're just pottering around town or cruising steadily like I am now, the engine is quiet, torquey, muscular, and a really generous fit for this car. It's a good engine for the class. And the gearbox is entirely workable too. We do have paddles for it here. They're sort of metallic effect paddles, better than you get in most of this car's rivals, if I'm honest. But really leaving the gearbox to its own devices is fine. It's tuned pretty well in the H6, tuned better than the Jolion, I think. What isn't tuned as well as the Jolion is the ride and handling of the H6. So we are on a different platform here, and while it's soft and comfortable, the control is what is lacking from a handling point of view. It's acceptable. I've certainly driven worse, but it's actually the recovery after hitting a bump which is a little bit uncomfortable with the H6. It's so soft that the body doesn't control itself quick enough, and so car journalists occasionally speak of this phenomenon called head toss, and that's something that you can experience for yourself if you take a car for a test drive. Just hit a bump, find a road that you know and hit a bump that you know is there, and just take note of whether the chassis really absorbs that bump or whether your head, like mine now, gets tossed and moved around by the bumps, because that's actually the dampers not really doing enough to contain the motion of the car. And in that sense, the H6's ride kind of reminds me of a last gen Kluger or something. Just very soft, comfortable in one sense, absorbent and pliant, but not settled enough. And it just pogos a little bit too much. And I am famously resistant to car sickness, but the H6 just starts going down that path a little bit. So one thing they could do for the next update for this car would be to firm up the suspension, because the actual chassis itself isn't that bad. It's just that the suspension has allowed too much motion coming off a bump, and so that could be firmed up without actually ruining that pliancy and that comfort element of the car. And the Jolyon actually manages to do that balance pretty well, so Haval doesn't have to look too far to work out how to do it. Similarly, the steering, well, the car steers, and the tyres themselves are actually quite respectable. We've got Hankook Ventus tyres on this car, not a bad tyre, and the outright level of grip is good, so you can turn this car in pretty aggressively and it'll just do it because of the good tyres. The steering itself is too slow though, and there's actually a little bit of a disconnect between the capability of those tyres and the chassis too, and the fact the steering actually requires quite a lot of input to be dialed into it before you start getting a meaningful response from the front end. So again, next update for this car, I'd recommend that they reduce the steering ratio just to have more of a direct feeling when you start adding steering into the car. But I like the fact that the steering wheel itself, unlike the Jolyon, does adjust 4 ways. It's got reach adjustment as well. We shouldn't even have to talk about that in 2021, but we do have to, because the car under this in the range in the GWM Haval lineup doesn't have that feature. In terms of refinement, it's actually not bad. We're on coarse chip here. I'm doing 70. It's nice and quiet in the car. The view out is really good. The mirrors are big, and we've got good view out the rear view mirror as well. And then we do have nice little toys, like the fact that the Lux and the Ultra get a 360-degree camera, really good resolution, one of the brightest and the best cameras in the class. Speaking of cameras, other little features you might care about, similarly from the mid-spec Lux and up, we have a dash cam USB, powered USB port ready to go, so you can set that up if you so desire. We've also got the full safety suite here. We've got adaptive cruise, we've got lane keep assist, we've got blind spot monitoring, we've got AEB that can detect pedestrians, cyclists, and crossroad traffic, front cross traffic. But interestingly, if you want rear cross traffic with AEB built into it, you have to go for the top spec car, so it evidently doesn't have those long range side-to-side sensors in anything other than the Ultra. So yeah, the driving experience of the H6 is a combination of good and bad, really. We've got a strong engine, we've got an acceptable gearbox, we've got a decent underlying chassis, but we've got a suspension that is just too soft and uncontrolled to really take the fight to the CX-5, Kodiaq, Tiguan, or the Tucson as well. So it's kind of, yeah, you've got to pick your priorities, I suppose, but you can see where the extra kind of 5 or 10 grand goes in some of those rivals. But we're talking about a big step up in cost then, aren't we? And for a lot of people, this is going to be good enough. So that's a detailed look at the new Haval H6. Look, my opinion on this car is that if you need a mid-size SUV to carry your family around and you want the benefits of a new car, like all the latest safety tech, that center airbag, lane keep assist, things like that that you're not going to get on a used car, plus the benefit of a long warranty and cheap servicing, then you need to look at the Haval H6 if your budget is constrained, because quite simply, you get a lot more car for your money than a low-end CX-5, Tucson, Sportage, and all the rest. Does this car feel as well put together as a Mazda CX-5? No, it doesn't. It doesn't handle quite as well, it doesn't go quite as well as some of the established vehicles in this segment, but it's not that far off. And just like the Jolyon, it's not that bad, and it's much cheaper than those established rivals. And for me, that's what makes the H6 deserving of a closer look, if that's your situation. But I'm keen to know your view, so let me know down below this video what you think of this car. Are you considering it? Are you going to preference something else? Let me know. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.